Start sharing my screen. You guys can see it, yes? So, at any time, if you guys want any questions, anything like this, I think we'll go over this like for 45 minutes, then kind of open up for like 15 additional minutes for questions. But I see that this is a little bit kind of a smaller class, so we're okay. If you have a question, I just ask the mediator if you have possible anything while I'm on a subject, it's fine. You can kind of pause me and then we can dive into it a little bit deeper. All right. So let's get started. How many of you guys know, like, or let's say in this sense, as we start talking about 42001, what are the key differences between 27001? Now, I can tell you from my perspective, a lot of times when I've done a lot of evaluations on organizations, and it seems like everybody is jumping into generative AI or agentic bots and just different things around AI. And what I normally do when I see these type of evaluations that come in, or when they ask me for about risk around these type of subjects, what I normally get is I start asking for documentation, right? And what I see a lot of times coming in from vendors when they start talking about their AI models and stuff like that, they'll say like, we've done some web application pen testing around these models. They present the web application pen test, and then they also start showing their ISO 27001 certification. That's fine and dandy, but that doesn't necessarily cover the risks that are around AI, right? And the reason why that is we'll kind of jump into these topics so you get a good understanding on why these audits are very important and to understand the key differences. What are the core focuses of each one of these? And so go on to the next slide. Give me 1 second. There we go. So when we talk about compliance, right, and we talk about like the types of different differences in these certifications, you have to kind of keep in mind what are the things, what do they focus on, right? So if I start looking at ISO 27001, what we kind of know here for sure is that there are some core things that are there, right? So we've all heard of information security management systems, which are really just it's like Annex A, they call it, and it's a bunch of controls. It's whatever is identified in ISO 27001. It basically tells you in the IT environment, these are the controls that you should have, their best business practices. ISO 27002 in their form of fashion tell you how to implement the controls, right? So when you start looking at the 27001, what we're really looking at is just like a bunch of documentation to begin with, because every governance starts with administrative controls, right? Without your governance in place, you're going to have a very weak posture, right? You're not going to be able to enforce things. At the end of the day, your basically your certification becomes nothing more than a paper trail. So in some bodies, they look at it, you kind of show them this ISMS. Now they have some more sophisticated ones. They have some that are just like an organization could put on an Excel spreadsheet and click on the Excel spreadsheet to some hyperlinks that just show you the documentation. What's supposed to happen is that you're supposed to go in further and you're supposed to look at during the certification process the different types of controls and the effectiveness of the control, right? So, like if you say I have access management in place, I need to dive into that policy and understand that policy. And I also need to understand what the technical controls are, the standards. How did you implement it? How do you control it? Right. And this is what you do during an audit. So audit comes in many different flavors normally, right? So always starts off with self assessments, right? So your internal teams will look at this, they'll say, okay, this is what we believe we're at, and they start documenting everything, and then we come in with an external auditing partner who looks at that information and confirms that it's actually correct. So this is one of the things that we're looking at. So when we see like the key focus of ISO 27001, the key focus is going to be on the controls, security controls, and the resilience, which have become a very, very popular. It's basically risk management framework, right? And around data security. 42001 AI governance is a little bit different and it's relatively new. I can be very clear with you guys. I have yet to see an organization. Well, I take it back. I only seen one organization that kind of leaned into ISO 42001, and that is Salesforce. I have not seen another organization have this certification. So, and what does that mean? That means roughly it's new, right? And some of the things that they're looking at and what they're aiming to do here is to make sure that, you have a reliable model, and that model, can really how should I say, provide the information that you need, right? And here you have to kind of like look at it in this sense, right? What are the core differences? Well, one side, you're kind of taking data, you're putting it input, getting an output. Well, both models actually do that, but you're dealing with your data. The problem in AI and what we kind of look at from a bias perspective is that that data is being exposed to go into larger language models so it can actually build up context around whatever you're asking, right? So we want to start looking at the safety of this. One of the things I've been fortunate to do is I kind of had the ability to write a paper, for example, with a colleague of mine on DeepSeek, right? And here's something to take into consideration on why the 42001 was probably created to kind of deal with this. Artificial intelligence is not really something brand new, even though we're kind of looking at it and saying, yes, this is the greatest thing since .coms, right? In reality, this has been around for a very long time, right? So I don't know how old or what the population is, but I can kind of give away my age. I'm 48 years old. And I remember when Google first started off. When I clicked in Google and I wanted to do some research for when I was going back to the University of or California State University Long Beach, right, in California, I remember Google coming out and I was like, wow, this is great because it helped me cut down on my research time, right? So that was fantastic. And the problem was over a period of time, Google started becoming more of a marketing tool, right? They got to make money somehow, some way. So they would take the data, the queries that we were always searching, and then eventually building up marketing around it, right? And you see that. You see that, like, for example, by asking, like, if we're talking about the ISO 27001, uh, let's just take a control. Like, you have to be able to monitor your environment for security incidents, right? So I can type in what is a SIEM in Google today, and I will get, like, I don't know, let's say first 5 or 6 pages, and get a little information because they have Gemini running on it as well, depending on what browser you use or Copilot. But before it was just giving me vendors. So give me Splunk, give me QRadar, give me whoever's in the space of SIEM technology, right? Now Palo Alto took over QRadar, but you get the understanding of what I'm talking about. So it didn't really give me the information. And then here came generative AI. So where generative AI, I can type in what is a SIEM, and it would give me a complete detail. It'll tell me also how to set it up. So it gives me back to that feeling like how Google was back in the early 2000s. The problem is this, right? In time, you will be able to see the vendors will be able to start manipulating the models possibly and start creating bias. And you've seen that with the example with DeepSeek, right? For example, you can ask DeepSeek problems about China, will not give you any information. As soon as you ask in DeepSeek, what are the issues with the United States, it'll tell you everything back to like the creation of the United States, what went wrong, right? Even some things are like a little bit questionable. Do they really happen occur to the United or because of the United States? DeepSeek would give it to you because it just kind of like slanders the government of the United States. And that's bias, right? It's bias built right into the models. So then you have to start asking yourself, okay, that means it can be manipulated by men because the Chinese government's manipulating DeepSeek. And if that's the case, then these models can also, you know, potentially lead into many other areas. When I was at one of my organizations, we started playing around. One of the early adopters when this was becoming more and more mainstream of allowing language models coming into HR. And what we seen was, we start off with some small chat bots and stuff like that, like everybody else does, right? HR got this idea. We brought a vendor on board, and they started off by being able to search our policies, for human resources, which are kind of considered internal documents, not super sensitive data. I mean, at the end of the day, they're probably cut and paste off of, what everybody else does in an organization, and then just say internal. But the problem was in this model that they were using, which was GPT at the end of the day, they were loading in the information, and it was just going to, from an API connection, it was going from the database further out. And eventually you could find whole scene documentation by just doing a Google search. So these are some of the examples that where it could be a little bit questionable. It's not, it's kind of like giving a data leak in essence. And it's interesting to see that because even the European Union kind of changed some rules around this. Of course, they want you to, make sure that you have everything in place to assure protection and do your due diligence. There's one thing that you have to keep in mind whenever you're dealing with security topics is that word due diligence, right? If you don't learn anything from today, you're going to learn about due diligence and negligence, the two nasty terms, because this goes back into the legality and what we do. Any questions so far? Good. Let's kind of dive into this, right? Let's talk a little bit about ISO 27001. Okay. Everybody, I'm sure, is very well aware of it, but this provides a framework. That's all these are, guys, by the way. They're just frameworks. They're best business practices. They give you some guidance because, just like in NIST, just like any of these other governance frameworks that are out there, they want the information to be available to you. So this way, everybody can apply some sort of protection mechanisms, right? That's why these have been created. And a lot of times why the different governments are kind of involved. In NIST is free documentation. So if I were you guys, just for out of sake, understand ISO, understand NIST, get into COBIT, get into all the different frameworks, and learn the crosswalking. Because one thing I will advise you on as we kind of dive into this topic is that eventually you'll end up into like probably a global company, maybe, right? And in global companies, you'll find out business segments within your organization will fall under different guidance, right? So if you have US based businesses, they'll probably be looking at NIST CSF or NIST 853, right? And here in Europe and maybe in some other parts of the world, they like say we want to be ISO certified, right? So what the idea is that if you as a security officer or you as an auditor in some ways can understand what the crosswalks are, right? So what is the same control from ISO to NIST to so on and so forth, your life is going to be a lot easier because you'll be able to see and understand what to do. So with that said, ISO is a framework just like that provide frameworks for security purposes, right? So in the 27001, what you have is you have a framework that's based around risk management, access control, and operational security, right? What that is trying to ensure is that the safety of the data. So that's something to keep in mind, the safety of the data. This is where, basically NICE 2 starts basing their premise off of, also GDPR, all these different regulatory bodies that the EU comprised of are usually based off this standard. So, and I always find it very interesting that, when organizations get these new regulations that start popping up, they start getting nervous, right? And they start asking a question like, are we are we compliant? Are we compliant with this regulation? Which is fine. Um, because if they follow ISO 27001, I can almost guarantee they're going to be compliant with every regulation that comes out. Every regulation that comes out usually just tries to enforce the ISO in different ways because again, organizations have a very tough time adapting governance. So you have a body, an authority body that just creates different compliance regulations to adhere to whatever governance framework. Most of it's going to be based around here. The EU is not doing anything special. So ISO 27001 is focused specifically on information security and data protection. So that's one of the key concepts, and that's something you need to understand. So when you build your ISMS, sure, you're going to build it around the different controls that protect data. Under ISO 42001 AI governance, it's a little bit different, right? So, like I said, you're dealing with API calls, you're dealing with multiple like other topics. I'm sure everybody kind of understands like, where does what happens in the back end of a system whenever you're dealing with generative AI? What are large language models? Where is data stored? And that's usually going to be in company databases. What is considered sensitive data? How far do you want it to go, right? In the ISO 42001, it kind of focuses a little bit different, right? So the trustworthiness is really going to be that question. Is it is it doing what they say it's going to do, right? Because you're introducing different algorithms. You're introducing, the possibility of data being leaked out. How many of you guys have ever played around with like, let's take it in simple terms, like something like Bedrock or GPT or Gemini or any of that stuff, and you start asking questions, start making prompts. You know, how many times do you get back, actually good information versus, misinformation? Or one thing I've noticed is I keep making prompts if I'm going down something like, let's say, legal GPT, where I'm playing around with contracts and seeing stuff. There's only so many times you can prompt before you start getting what they call hallucinations inside the models, right? Where the data stops making sense. And then you have to go back and you have to refresh the model. You have to go back to a different prompt in the past to kind of start leading it back into the same direction that you wanted it to go in. This is a problem, right? Because, at the end of the day, what you have to remember when you're dealing with all these different language models, this is basically data that's been stored from many different sources. And I can give you a good visual of what that looks like, right? So I'm going to say it in these terms. I remember I told you guys I went to California State University, Long Beach. I ended up getting my degree from University of Maryland, but I went to California State University, Long Beach when I was younger. Um, and one of the things I remember is I used to like to hang out in the library, right? So in the library, Long Beach State has a fairly decent sized library. They have like 4 floors, kind of a big building, it's the biggest building on campus. And it was full of books, right? So you go downstairs, it had like the place where you could have Starbucks, and you had like magazines, newspapers, and you had like reference books, right? Like, people that did their thesis, doctorate thesis and stuff for the university. And then like core reference books or like books that are related to classes. Like you could find older books for whatever class you were taking in there, and any references around that. Second floor was like more about like your novels, right? Like if you were taking something like maybe um, liberal arts and you needed to go in and read novels or writing or something, that was the second floor. Third floor was like all about mathematics and engineering. Fourth floor was all about like medical journals and stuff like that. This is how it was set up. So in 2018, I take my daughter, from California to back to the university, and I'm walking around. I told her like, Dad used to hang out at Vec Hall, which is like an engineering department. It was for computer science, computer engineering. And then I said I also hung out in the business department. So I was doing my degree at the time in entrepreneurship. And then I took her to where the basketball court is, just taking a tour around the campus. And then I told her, I said, you know what, though? Let's go stop by the library. This is where I spent most of my time. And I was like, it's pretty cool. They had couches in there, they had study rooms. It was really nice. So, and she's like, okay. And we walked into the library. Starbucks was still there, but the first floor was all computers. And I was like shocked. I was like, wait, did they move the computer lab? Because I used to be on the like south side of campus. So I was like, oh, let's go. Let's go to the second floor. Go to the second floor, all computers. Third floor, all computers. Fourth floor, mostly computers, but they had a little lounge place in the back corner where they had some local newspapers and magazines. And nobody was there. Everybody was sitting on computers. And it dawned on me at that point was, holy crap, they just digitized every book in the world, right? From a university perspective. And all universities have done this, especially, well, I won't say all, but in the States, it was that way. Like, I was shocked because I went back and I finished my degree with University of Maryland back in 2015. And I remember like going through and going, wow, this is actually pretty cool because I can reference every book online. So, needless to say, this is kind of like the beginning. This is a premise of where AI is starting to head and where it's coming from. These large language models, they're taking all that data and putting it into like different categories, storing it like in a, let's say, think of it as a massive database. And when you start querying this, right, and especially with your own projects and your own ideas, you're basically asking, you're using your computer, a calculator, to calculate data and pull data from other resources and build it in a contextual way, right? It's the problem with the most of these AI bots is it's going to give you the information in the same manner, no matter what, right? We all see it. We see it in like emails. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day and blah, 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 blah. All the same layout. So it's easy to spot, who's using it and who isn't. But with that said, this is kind of like where you start getting into bias and you start having to like really think about what is the impact. I was fortunate. I had an opportunity to go to the United Nations and work on AI for developing countries with some Chinese individuals as part of the Swiss cyber Chinese law, or sorry, the Swiss Chinese Law Association. That's who it is. And some interesting topics came out of that, right? So the problem is that this one lady, she talked about a lawyer, right, from New York, and maybe you guys heard this case or not, who used GPT to do some cases and case studies back in the day. And basically what he did is, he was representing a client. He used GPT to in its early state, so like GPT 2.5 or something like this, to help him with his case. And he was able to build a case that helped defend his client. And he turned it over to the judge. And the judge said, wow, look at it. Interesting. I've never seen these cases. But if these are right, then then maybe the client's not guilty, right? So he told the lawyer, he said, can you do me a favor? Can you go back and you ask about this or find out those sources? So the guy went back and he went back to GPT, because it kind of remembers some of the historical, it saves your prompts, right? And he asked basically, hey, what are the sources to this? And it pulled sources and it gave it to him. So, and then he went back to the court the next day and gave it back to the judge and said, here you go. And the judge said, wow, this is interesting. I never heard of this. But, anyways, he handed it over to the clerk and asked the clerk to look him up. And the clerk tried and did not find any of them. Right. And this is one of the first big cases where hallucination came into play. Well, what I ended up telling most of those people that were on that floor, and it was like 50 different countries and like maybe all I would say 95% were attorneys. I told them at that time, I said, "Oh, I don't think that the hallucination was because it just made up the data. The data was there, right? At the end of the day, somebody put it in. And if I'm thinking about how the universities are, I'm thinking about all that data that's being stored inside of these different platforms, large language models, and it's just referencing. Maybe it's pulling data and it's confusing different things, based on what's in the back end. So maybe those cases, for example, existed, but they weren't real cases. They were mock cases, right? Because there's a lot, as you go through university, there's a lot of mock trial. You have to do that. Or somebody wrote about the cases that could be and how law works. So these are the things. And this is what you really want to focus on. When you're looking at something and getting certified in 42001 or doing an audit, you're looking at this to say, what can we do? Like, what is it that makes this trustworthy data? What kind of tests are you doing, right? Because they are different tests. So let's think about it this way. When we're looking at it for the core differences in the overlaps, right? The scope, for example, in 27001 is all going to be always remember data protection. So when somebody provides you 27001 and says it covers their AI model, no, it doesn't. 42001 looks at system behavior. Where is the data being pulled from? How far is the data going out, right? There are differences, right? In 27001, you can do network pen testing and you can do web application pen testing or application pen testing, right? As part of your controls. In 42001, you need to be doing LLM pen testing, which is different. It's about prompt injections. It's about data and how far it gets out. Does it leak out of the database? Right? Am I able to, if I'm sitting in company X and company Y is using, let's say, an LLM and generative properties, can I make a prompt on the same model and pull in that company's data? Guess what? The answer is yes, probably. If I make the prompt just right, if there's no controls in place. And that's what 42001 is all about, making sure that you have that. Also, the difference in risk, right? So it's always about 27001 is about breach and loss. 42001 also kind of covers that, right? But it also talks about bias and harm. So, as for example, in China, you have bias in every Chinese model. And it's a concern, right? That means they can control the data. The biggest thing that you have to think about in these terms is at the end of the day, right now we're growing very dependent on these different platforms, right, to be able to solve complex situations, to be able to help us write reports. When will it switch? When will it do Google, right? When will it be, the company that pays the most is the one that's going to be able to feed the data. So people then become their customer, as an example, because that could be around the corner. But this is what 42001 is starting to look at, right? Versus 27001. So 27001 focuses on the triad, right? Whereas 42001 is about the responsibility of the models. So I was kind of giving you a little bit of an example how they can also overlap, right? So the ISO on both annexes, as you start building them, you're going to find a lot of like cross references, right? So they're going to have some of the same type of objectives, the same type of controls. But at the end of the day, these controls, I'm looking, sorry guys, it's 45 minutes. How much more time do I have?
Yeah, you can still go.
Okay, good, good. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wanted to make sure.
No, no, no,
So,
no. You
so
can still go.
okay, so I'll continue on. Please bear with me, guys. I'll go a little bit quicker for this. For the most part, right, the ISO certification on both parties, or both standards, you're going to find have some overlapping, which is good. It's built that way. But these are also they give you, like I said, that cornerstone of any type of security program, and are equally as important. So let's kind of look at some spotlights, right? So kind of like why this would be important, right? So think about it in this way. Um, in healthcare, we're dealing with like PHI, right? Personal healthcare information. And then sometimes you don't want this stuff to get out, right? So the ISO 27001 would be making sure that your electronic records are secure, right? That you data doesn't leak out. Where the 42001 can be making sure that the algorithms, right, validate the diagnosis, give you accurate data, right? And also still look at the safety, right, of that information. I'm give you an example. So everybody remembers Watson, right? Watson was like one of the first models that were, used for AI, and they brought it into a show called Jeopardy. And Watson did an amazing job. He beat the champion of Jeopardy hands down, very easy because it just was able to retrieve data real quick. Then IBM got the bright idea in early stages and said, let's start doing clinical trials and help with cancer and cancer diagnosis and also treatment. The problem was the data that was feeding in that was all over the place. And what ended up happening is that IBM ended up having to kill the program because it caused even more harm to the patients that it was trying to diagnose. Well, that's because, again, there was nothing there. There's no validation. It was kind of early stages. They probably shouldn't have done that. They should have left it in like some other trial periods. But this is what this is. So 42001 is going to be focused more on, the assurance of the data. What about in finance and banking, right? In finance and banking, a good case study can be like for the 27001, right? You want to make sure that, let me kind of put it in this way. You want to make sure that data is protected. Now, I worked at Six Group for a while. Some of the data that we would see, for example, payment cards, right? So PCI, DSS, and stuff. You don't want any of this information getting out. Well, ISO 27001 gives you the controls on protecting and identifying it, cyber attacks and all this kind of stuff. That could get around that data. PCI DSS gives you another regulation on top of that where it kind of like tells you what you can and cannot apply to it, right? Like getting rid of payment card information on personal laptops, keeping them in centrally stored locations, stuff like that. You'd be surprised. Where now we get into 4200 001, where do you see AI being used? Well, you see it being used in like high frequency trading, right? People are trying to use it for credit scores, right? And other things, they're probably using it in the government aspect for, let's say, payments for welfare, right? These kind of examples. So what you want to make sure is that your bot or the API that's feeding all this, or let's say agentic when you're getting in here, does not allow it to be manipulated, doesn't pull from sources that could lead to discrimination, or doesn't cause harm to people. Again, an early adapter to AI was Australia for actually like welfare program. And again, in being one of the early adapters, it caused more harm than it did good. In fact, what it didn't take into account when they first turned it on was people's situations. What it only did was focus on basic information that said, your policy says people can only be on insurance or on welfare for 6 months. After that, everybody's cut off. So, and it just started cutting people off the welfare program. When in fact people had like unique situations, right? So that's a problem. Dynamics. So that's what these models are basically for. They kind of help in these areas. Otherwise, just imagine if the governing bodies didn't come out with something, same thing with EU focused on AI, we would be still probably sitting in the area of causing harm. We would be in the area of like losing uh, people because of issues that are with the system, right? So, and I'm saying losing people like with Watson, it would never change. So they start looking at the reliability of data. Now, the return on investment and integrating both the compliance topics, right? So you have to start with integrated implementation, right? That is like taking both where you can kind of crosswalk across ISO 27001 and ISO 42001. There are some things that are similar, right? And you can apply that within both annexes. The sequential implementation are going to be those extra controls that you put in place. Like, for example, if I'm uploading documentation into my database for AI to look at and give me some reference information, I want to make sure that some of those controls around there does not allow it to go out, especially if it's sensitive data. So these different controls are going to be where you have to kind of spend a little extra. Then you're going to go into prepping and cost for audits, right? And this is kind of what this chart is like looking at. So anytime that I'm looking for an audit prep to make sure that the controls are in place, it's going to be 100%, everything is going to be a cost. So you can already write down to management, because that's one of the key elements. You can always write down to management that there's going to be a cost behind it, because you're implementing controls, you're spending time, you're getting experts to come in and determine whether or not the organization is ready for an audit. And then unified, because you might have some controls already in place, right? From the 27001, for those that are already there, you can estimate to management already that the cost is going to be probably, there's some similarity. So we'd say a 70% increase in cost. And one of those major cost elements is going to probably be around what we call a LLM pen test, right? Those are not cheap. Basically, it's a red teaming exercise on your models. So quantifying the compliance risk, one of the things in cybersecurity that we always like to look at is we like to have some equations. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can see, for me, whenever I quantify something, I always find it very difficult to do so because, to me, when I quantify cyber risk, it's really like putting the finger in the air and saying, this is what I feel. You have some equations to get into that. Yes, you can look at it, but I wouldn't, if they ask for a cost estimate, you can use this. But the reality of the situation is that depending on the type of incident that occurs, you're going to find out what the cost impact is right as that incident occurs, right? So, for example, in cyber attacks like ransomware, we can say, okay, based on this situation, the cost is going to be 5 million a day or something like that, or 5 million a month, until you get ransomware and production stops, and then you realize, no, it's 25 million a day. This is why ransomware is so successful and gangs pay so much money or get so much money, because business stops. It stops to operate. But looking at this, here's an equation you can use. I think you guys will get the slide. Implementation roadmap, right? So whenever we do an audit, the first thing we're going to do is first build your ISMS. You'll have one for 42001. You have one for 27001. And you want to go through and you want to assess your environment. Make sure that you have your governance, your administrative controls in place. Then you're going to look at your technical controls that assure your administrative controls. And if it's requiring, which in today's world it's not as much anymore, requires some physical controls, make sure they're in place. That's what the gap analysis is. And you have to really be thorough about this, right? Let me give you a common gap analysis that's always overlooked inside an organization as an example, and why I'm talking about it has to be thorough. If we're looking at 27001, for example, and one of the gap analysis is going to be vulnerability management, right? That's a control. You have to scan your systems, you have to patch your systems, right? How do you think most organizations get by and say, check the box, we're good with that? Well, they have a governance document that's called a patch document, patch policy. And they usually show that to the auditor. But if I go to the scans, let's say Tenable or Qualys, in almost every organization I've been in, I've seen hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. So you as an auditor, when you're looking at this stuff, it's very important that you actually get your hands dirty and get into the systems. Documentation is fine. The ISMS allows it to be very easily organized. That's what the ISMS is, organizing your documentation before an audit comes in so you can do it in minimal time. but you have to understand what you're looking at. The same thing applies for the 42001. So you need to make sure that you're able to jump in. Scope and definition. That's one of the next big topics. Here's the other funny thing, right? So again, like I told you, a lot of providers, SaaS models are using generative AI, and they're always showing me an ISO 27001, 2022, right? Sometimes even 2013. And they're saying, oh, we're certified. Well, there's a problem there, right? The 42001 kind of gives me some assurance that as a third party, that third party went through some sort of evaluation on their AI model. The 27001 doesn't tell me anything. And that's what makes this very important. So, on top of it, the 20001 doesn't even have a scope half the time. I can tell you, I can be certified from ISO 27001 on my SAP system. In the meantime, I developed a brand new product and I launched it and I'm selling it to you as a service. And I'm using my 27001 for SAP to say I'm certified. Something to think about. Integrated risk assessments, right? So you have to look at both, right? Looking at hacking possibilities, but also with drift, right? From an AI specific perspective. Always look at the threat landscape in a holistic view. That's what this is kind of telling you. Like, how do you do this? You have to make sure that anytime you're looking at it, so the ISO 27001 controls have to be assessed in a holistic view. That, or same with the 42001, everything that it has access to, for example, in the back end, has to be assessed. A lot of organizations don't like to do that. They like to give defined scopes. And this is why companies keep on getting data breaches. And a unified audit, right? So you want to make sure that you put your audits together, that they're concurrent. This is how you build a roadmap in order to make sure that you get compliant. Any questions?
Yes, I'm sure we're gonna be getting a lot of questions after this insightful session. So the chat box is officially open for the questions now. I guess when you were giving the session before, like there was one question before the session was going on, and it was, is it necessary to for an organization should implement the both ISO 27001 and ISO 42001?
Remember what I said, the key aspects here are called due diligence and negligence. So to answer your question, I would say yes. If you're using an AI model, you should have 42001 certification as a means. The certification at the end of the day just means that it's been audited and that it passed an audit. And they're basically a snapshot. They're good for now. That means you have the basic controls in place. And some certifying body says yes. That's really all this is. So, in my opinion, yes, it's important if you're using generative AI models that yes, the 42001 is present, especially if you're getting it from your SaaS provider, right? That they have that. Because what happens is this: if you're a company that's inside Europe, or let's say, and maybe even in India, or now like all the governments are kind of coming in with their own privacy acts and stuff like this. If you're one of these individuals in that country and you bought a service that does not have these certifications, right? And something bad happens, you didn't even do an evaluation on the organization, and something bad happens, right? Then who's responsible? And that's the key question. You will find in almost every terms and conditions from any organization, the responsibility lies back on the data owner. And you, as an organization, you're the data owner. You can't get away from that. So it's important that that you have those certifications, because at least here you can show, one, you collected, you're basically doing a mini audit whenever you do a third party assessment, and two, you have some collection of evidence that they met best business practices. Because if they don't meet best business practices, then you're going to find out where the negligence was. And the negligence, what does that mean? That means an organization failed to meet the controls that are abundant. That's what this is. This is what governance frameworks are. Their information that's provided publicly for any organization to follow in order to meet the best practices. So, yes, if you want assurance, and this is what it comes down to, you want assurance, it's important that they have these certifications. But let me tell you, in reality, in today's world, 40 ISO 42001, how many organizations have it? Probably 1%. How many organizations have AI involved? Probably 80 to 85%. So there's a huge discrepancy here. Any other questions?
Yeah, I hope that answered your question. It was from Jayakar. Yeah, the second one that we have is from Satyanarayana, a manufacturing organization certified for QMS ISO 9001. What are the steps need to be taken to shift to AIMS ISO 42001?
So, okay, one of them is focused on quality assurance, and this is usually manufacturing. You're dealing specifically with IT when you get into the 27 and 42, right? So the quality assurance side is okay. You can have that. You're certified. Good. Look at this as a new journey. So there are elements that you can probably take, especially quality of systems, especially in OT environment, that may depend on AI. But even more so, you're going to have to follow and set up an ISMS for these other certifications. It's a At the end of the day, it's a paper rock drill, right? And what I mean by that is you have to create the documentation and get certified. They are different certifications.
Definitely, I hope that answered Satyanarayana's question. And there is one more. With the current pace at which AI models are rapidly evolving, do you think that the day of AGI, in brackets sentient AI system, is not too far away?
Say again, don't quite get that. The
With the
AGI,
current pace,
you're talking about
with the
agenic?
current AGI, I mean, I don't know the full form of it, but yeah, I can search for you. Or maybe
Okay.
Siddheshwar, you can drop it in the chat box. So the question is with the current pace at which AI models are rapidly evolving, do you think that the day of AGI, a sentient AI system, is not too far away?
Um, let me kind of say it like in this sense. Data is being like rapidly used. Do I think we're going to end up with a system like Jarvis if you ever watch like Iron Man? Not yet, right? The thing that you have to remember about all of this, the data is being aggregated from somewhere, and some human being had to put that in. The generative part, like what they've basically done in the algorithm, if you can think of it in these terms, what they've basically done in the algorithm is, and you see it, is just basically turn the language into a mathematical problem. So X being the, Y being a, right? And when you run the algorithm, you put in data, the data subject is you, and then it just populates the data around the contextual sentence. And then I can ask it to kind of add fluff, basically, the model. And it kind of keeps building it up. Still got to check the sources, right? Because it's pulling, like I said, the school library is now digital. It's pulling data from all those books. It's pulling data from other sources. And what you see, what feels interesting is that you're just seeing data being presented to you. On manufacturing, it's still manipulating and pulling and playing around with data sensitivity. Most people still have to work on HMIs. Most people still have to work in the factory and push buttons to make sure it works. The automation isn't there. Now, do I think in the future that it can actually get to that point? Possibly, right? So, and here I just think that the classic computing system has to change. I think once we go into the quantum computers and they start building programs and stuff like that, yes, you're definitely going to have that. But for right now, we're using calculators. Just think of it in those terms. You went from the computer, like in the very basic way to say it, went from a calculator that just did add, subtract, and minus to a scientific calculator into a very nice graphic calculator. And that's kind of like the age that we're living in. And it will get a color screen, right? Your graphic calculator. I think for to get the idea like Jarvis, like what you've seen in the movies and stuff, that's going to be quantum. That has to be in quantum computing.
Course. There's one more question,
Sure.
and yeah, it says how we can ISO 40,001 audit engage with the hybrid model infra.
Hybrid model. You mean like half cloud, half on prem or an infrastructure?
Yeah, that's what he means.
Okay. Again, 42001, right, is looking at the backend data sources. So if you have on prem, like to me, on prem is really just like a private cloud that you're having access from external systems into that area. 42001 looks at it a little bit different, right? You're going to be looking at the databases, you're going to be looking at the whole model, and you're looking at the back end, right? So one of the things I always advise in a LLM pen test, for example, make files, make canary tokens, make stuff like that, and watch how far it goes into the system and the subcomponents of the system, right? What you really want is if you're in the cloud environment, you want data to sit in your tenant space and not go out. Is there a potential for it to go out? Of course there is. But with the bigger cloud providers, you have some kind of guarantees. If they say no, at least they're going to be able to pay you for the damages. So on-prem stuff, the same thing again. You know, if you have sensitive data, and this goes around data classification policies, there might be some elements where you have to add extra layer of security to those type of particular systems, whether in the cloud or on-prem. Maybe you have to create your own LLM for those models and do not tie it into the company basic chatbots. Don't feed it. There's many different things, but the certifications are there to kind of give you guidance, right? Even if you don't get certified, it's good practice to understand what you're looking at, build your ISMS off of that, and be able to apply those controls at minimum. I don't think you have to get certified. I'm not telling you you need that 100%, depending on your organization, but I'm telling you to use those controls, keep them in place. Yes. Because they give you guidance. It's like, it gives you some idea where you should be, if that makes sense.
Definitely, I guess like this has given answers to all the questions. And yes, Manish is also saying thank you. So, I guess like it
Okay.
made sense to him. And yes, like I guess like if we don't have any more questions, then yeah, that was it. But yeah, like I'm just trying to see if we're getting any questions. Yeah, I guess that was it. So
Okay.
thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of today's session. We have gained very much amazing insights from Joel, and it's been truly inspiring. And now, before we wrap up, would you like to hear any final thoughts that you have to make, and any closing message that you would like to leave us for today's session?
Sure, I can. Like I said to everyone here, Get used to the terms due diligence and due care and negligence, because every decision that you're going to make are going to fall in one of those categories: due diligence, due care, and negligence. And those are all legal terms. The governance is there to give you due care or due diligence, and then you can perform the due care by applying everything there. Anything that you skip over is negligence, and that's where you get in trouble. So if you don't get anything out of this, understand that those certifications are there to help you, to give you guidance on best practices, and it's up to you to make the to apply the rules. Otherwise, you're going to face the penalties, and that is negligence. So I appreciate everybody's time. I hope it was insightful for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or however you want. And I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you once again. I always like to kind of do this. One, like you said, gets me into the subject, keeps refreshing into my mind. I advise everybody to try to teach in their life. That's one other thought. And yeah, anytime you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, I have dropped Joel's LinkedIn in the chat box in case if you would like to connect with him. There's always room for it. So make sure that you're connecting with him on LinkedIn. And yes, before you guys go, I have some announcements to make. If you're ready for certification for today's session, you can opt it right now from the website. We're giving a complimentary coupon to all the participants, which gives you 20% offer, and I'm sharing the link along with it. And also GSTC is very excited to launch a utility tool where you can get a professional presence for yourself, a resume, and which will open the global opportunities for you. And those who have joined this webinar, it's completely free for you all. It comes with the coupon code AUG100. Use this code and get 100% off, or just is inclusively for the webinar attendees. So go grab your chance and use the utility tool to take your career level to the next level. And yes, with that, like we have amazing panel for the upcoming events as well. And since the holiday season is just around the corner, we're having 4 sessions for the next week for the compliance in context, applying ISO 42001 and ISO 27001 across industries on the topics mentioned from 8th to December to 11 December, starting at 8:30 p.m. SGT, 8 p.m. IST, 8:30 a.m. CST. And with that comes the upcoming event in the Learning in Practice Real World L&D case studies across industry 2, with 3 special sessions from 8 December to 10th December, 9:30 a.m. CST, 11:30 p.m. SGT. And yes, one more for the AI implementation series from December 8th to December 10th, 9:30 p.m. SGT, 7 p.m. IST. And it's time to give shout out to the people who have known as the referral champions. Big shout out to Astik, Rakesh, and Bandi for making our initiative bigger and helping us reach so many more people. And you can be a part of this too. All you have to do is invite your colleagues to the webinar and sharing the registration link on gstccouncil.org. Every referral earns you point to climb up the leaderboard. The top 3 leaders on the ladder get a chance to receive a complimentary vouchers worth $400 from GSTC. And if you would like to be a part of our learning capsule, webinar, or podcast, you can reach out to me on gauri@gstccouncil.org. We will get you started. And we would love to connect with you. This is the where you can scan all the links of the GSTC on LinkedIn and the website, as well as the WhatsApp community group where you get daily updates about all the sessions that are happening. And if you could leave your sessions takeaway on reviews.io, that will definitely mean much to us. So with that, we come to an end for today's session. Once again, Joel, thank you so much. I have shared Joel's links, and yes, you can connect with him. And I will be seeing you all in the next session for the next week. Till then, stay curious, stay motivated, and a happy night. Thank you so much, Joel, once
Thank you.
again.
All right. Good
Yes.
night.
Good night.